We've seen how to use a grid in a panel object. Now we'll see the considerations we need to have if we add more than one grid to the panel. We'll build a panel object that shows the attractions and cities of a country received by parameter. To do so, we select Save As from the Attractions CF panel and name it View, Country, Info, CF panel. Then we remove its main object setting, because the goal is to have it called from the List of Attractions panel when the country's name is clicked on. In the Rules tab, we add a parm rule with an input parameter, the country ID attribute. And in the form, we add the country name attribute and delete the country ID variable of dynamic combo type, since we won't choose a country, but will receive it by parameter. To group all the data of the attractions, and then the data of the cities, we insert a table control from the toolbar, and we'll place the variables attraction name from, attraction name to, the grid, and the variable total trips inside the table. Now to the right, we insert another table as a separator, and then we insert a grid to show the cities of the country with the attributes city ID and city name. We add titles to the sections, placing a text block, Attractions, above the Attractions section, and Cities above the Cities section. We change the class to text block title. To define how we want the contents of a table to be seen, we must change the size of the rows or columns of the table. For example, we want the grids to have enough space in the corresponding row to be displayed correctly, and to assign more space to the column of the table that shows the content of the attractions, because we have more things to show than for the cities. For that, we have the column style and rows style properties of the board. First, we'll change the columns that we know are three: the column that contains the attractions data, the column with the separating table, and the column that contains the cities data. If we select Table 1 and click on the column style property, we can see that by default, each column takes up 33% of the available space. The possible values to be assigned to the width of the columns are a percentage of the total table space, or in device independent pixels, DIPs. This measure allows us to assign units that are an abstraction of a pixel, which do not depend on the platform and will later be converted to real pixels when the application is executed. The number of pixels that each DIP will take up depends on the dimensions of the screen. This allows us to scale to different screen sizes using standard sizes. Let's assign 50% to the first column, 25% to the second column, and 25% to the third column of the available space. This space is what remains after having assigned the columns with dips. In other words, the percentages are relative to the value that results from subtracting the fixed values from the total width, in dips. Now, we change the height of the rows. We click on the rows style property and see that, by default, all the rows have a 20% assigned, except the fourth row, which is where the grids are located. We see that here we can assign the values using percentages, dips, and platform default. This last value varies between platforms, and for the same platform, it also depends on the cell's content. We're going to assign that value to all the rows except row 4 where the grids are, which we set to occupy the 100% that remains available. If we right-click to see the navigation of the object we built, we can see that the output window shows an error. And if we look at the error in the navigation list, it says that the load event cannot be programmed if we have multiple grids. If we go to the events, we see that we still have the load event programmed as we had it in the original object. Here we don't consider what we said before, that it would have been better to use the load event of the grid and not the generic one to avoid that situation. So we add grid 1 to the load. If we select View Navigation, we can see that the problem has been solved. Before running, we go to the Attractions CF panel and add the Country ID attribute required to go to the information panel of a country when we click on the name of the country in the grid. Then we add to the country name attribute a tap event, where we write the invocation to the View Country Info CF panel, passing it the country ID as a parameter. We run it to see all this. If we click on France, the information of the country France is opened, showing us the attractions with the total number of trips of each attraction and the global total trips to France. To the right are the cities of that country. If we go to the navigation list, we see that now there is a level detail entry for grid 1 and another one for grid 2. For grid 1, we see the access to the attraction table and the navigation of the formula that we saw when we implemented the Attractions CF panel. If we select the node corresponding to grid 2, we see that the grid is accessing the country city table to show the cities, and that the filter being used is country ID by the attribute received in the parm rule. In a similar way to the totals we show for the attractions and the filter by name, we'll show the number of attractions of each city and the total number of attractions in the country, and we'll add a filter by city name. In the Variables tab, we create an attractions variable, another one called Total Attractions, and a third one called City Name. Now we add the attractions variable to the grid by setting its label position property to none. Then we add total attractions below the grid and the filter variable city name above the city grid. Let's add to the grid the necessary condition for the filter. Before that, we take the opportunity to assign the base transaction property in country.city. Here, we click on Conditions and write the filter condition using the like operator, since we will not filter by name range, but by a name similar to the one we put in the filter. Then we add the grid2.load event, where we load the attractions variable with a count formula with the attraction name attribute. Since the base table of the grid is country city, the formula will only count the attractions of the city corresponding to each line. To calculate the total number of attractions, for the same reasons as when we calculated the total number of trips, we wrote the grid2.refresh event, in which we programmed a for each command on the attractions table to count the attractions, which will be filtered by the attribute of the country identifier received by parameter. If we now see the panel navigation list, in the node Level Detail Grid 2, we see the navigation of the for each command to the attraction table, and below it, the navigation of the count formula on the attraction table. And here we see the filter we added by country name. Let's run our main object, Attractions CF panel, to see what we did. We click on France again, and now we can see the total number of attractions of each city of France, and the total number of attractions of the country France. We saw that because we had more than one grid in the panel, we had to use the refresh and load event of each grid. But after adding these events, we wonder what would be the triggering order of these events in relation to the events of the panel object. When the panel object is executed for the first time, The triggering order of event execution will be, first, the start event, only once, then the generic refresh event, in other words, the panel's own refresh event, and finally, the refresh of the first grid. If it has a base table, the load event of the grid will be executed as many times as records are retrieved from the database, filtering the corresponding records. If it doesn't have a base table, the load event of the grid is executed only once, and if it's a grid based on an SDT, the load event is not executed. And then the same with the refresh and load events of the second grid. Since there is more than one grid, the refresh command must also be specialized to indicate which grid you want to refresh. The generic refresh command, the one we had seen when we used it in the attractions CF panel, causes the generic refresh event to be executed, as well as the refresh and load event of each grid, that is, everything but start. And now we also have the refresh method of a grid, which will refresh only the grid. That is to say, run the grid refresh and load n times, once, or never, depending on whether the grid has a base table or not, or if it's a grid of a collection SDT variable, respectively. In this video, we saw how we can work with multiple grids in a panel object. In this case, with parallel grids, and the considerations we need to have when invoking the events of each grid. In this course, we will not address the topic of nested grids in the panel object.